Hey everybody, and welcome to the Rock and Roll Farming Podcast. And today I am tremendously excited to be heading down to that London town to talk to the editor of the nation's favourite farming publication, Farmers Weekly, Andrew Meredith. Andrew, how are you?
I'm very well. Thanks for having me on, Will.
That's right. Um, you're editor of Farmers Weekly. I've mentioned that you're in London, obviously, the centre of the publication world, but you couldn't be from further away from that because you are from rural mid Wales.
That's right. Born and brought up on a farm named Upper Letherlynwen, which means side in the severe wind for non-Welsh speakers, which is it's yeah, it's a very accurate farm name. It's always a little bit chillier up there than it is in many other spots, but it's an absolutely beautiful farm, beautiful place to have been brought up. Mum and dad still farming there. But here I am, several hundred miles away, because this is where the Farmers Weekly office is based, and I started before COVID when it was predominantly an office-based job, apart from when we were out on farm, of course.
Yeah. Deep roots in Paris, in mid Wales.
Absolutely, yeah. My grandfather bought the farm in the 1950s, but he only moved from the neighbouring farm. And then my mother's family are only from 20 miles away, proper borders country, from near Knighton, which is Offa's Dyke, actually goes right through their farm.
Does it? Yeah, okay. Yeah, so you we're not a million. Knighton's a beautiful spot, but Offa's Dyke's not very far from our farm either. So you're just a bit further south.
Yeah, and then my friends always tease me because particularly since moving to England, make great play of my Welsh heritage. But then they always remind me that actually, of course, I was born in Hereford, so the English then can lay claim to me as well. So I don't know what the definition of a Welsh person is, Will, but I feel Welsh, and I certainly felt even more Welsh once I went to university in Aberystwyth and got to know a lot more Welsh re really culturally Welsh people. Powys, and particularly the nearer to the border you get, I think it is a slightly culturally ambiguous area. We didn't really spend a lot of time thinking about Welsh football or Welsh rugby in school, or certainly I didn't. My career wasn't very sporty back then, and none of us were Welsh speakers apart from learning it in class. I always tell people who aren't from Wales that it's spoken much more the further up the mountain you go, or the further or the nearer the coast that you get. I don't know if you'd agree with that.
Yeah, I would actually, because where we are, and obviously I haven't got much of a Welsh accent, which much to my lifelong disappointment. But you only have to go, I guess, 5 or 6 miles west of us, and it just suddenly changes. The accent changes, the language changes, the topography changes.
Yeah,
It feels much more Welsh. But where I am, although we're in Wales, it really feels like Shropshire.
I did my placement year in Pembrokeshire, and it's very apparent there because you can go very short distances and meet first language Welsh people, and
Mm,
then go a bit further down the road, and it's an incredibly anglicised area again.
mm,
And it really seems to, both aspects are very deep rooted, and it doesn't feel like either language is spreading much further. It's sort of locked in those pockets in a sort of in a charming way, really. But I
yeah.
suppose particularly the Welsh side may wish that um, the Welsh language would spread a bit further down there.
Yeah, well, watch this space. I suppose if
Yeah,
you listen to Welsh government's plans, they've got they're very ambitious in that regard, aren't they? But okay, Aberystwyth, you mentioned.
mm.
What did you study there? Agriculture or something different?
I started studying law
Oh,
and did a
wow.
year
Okay,
of that in
interesting.
2006, and then so I had been brought up on the farm, as I said. But always had one eye on slightly escaping it. I liked farming, but I never loved it. Is the sort of, I suppose,
Mm,
best way to describe it. And as most farmers listening know, you kind of have to love it to succeed and want to make the sacrifices as well as have the joys that are involved with that. So law seemed to be the answer. I was sort of a typically academic person, quite good at the exams, and I
hmm
thought, that'll be something that'll suit me, and couldn't have been further from the truth. Sometimes you don't find these things out until you try them, of course. But after a year, I was, failing at my classes in a real rut, thinking made a huge mistake because obviously it's the biggest thing at that age I'd ever failed at, and so it's quite a big deal. So didn't know quite what to do. Went back to my comfort zone, decided to change to agriculture. I thought, I know I can succeed at this. Another big leap, of course, in hindsight, but I thought this will give me a fighting chance to get back on the road to a bit more university success. And it was a great choice. I was really pleased to make the switch. But also pleased to, the further you go from that year of failure, the more I reflect on it and think it was a character building year. Met a
Mm.
lot of brilliant people, still friends with some of them today. And so, no regrets.
Yeah,
Okay, a
it's
few regrets, but not many.
yeah, it's funny, isn't it, when you're that age? Um, it's funny what time does, isn't it? At that age, as I think a lot about this as I get older, you don't realize when you're young how much time you've got in front of you, which sounds really obvious thing to
Yeah,
say, but the years just go faster as you get older, don't they? But when you're that age, something that seems like the end of the world really isn't, is it?
no,
And it can lead to other opportunities, as you say.
it's I think it's a tough job for parents, isn't it? Because they want to support and push a
Mm,
little bit often kids to meet their potential, but in doing so, obviously you build up these qualifications and make them so meaningful. And sometimes they are, sometimes they're essential. But of course, you can make your way through life in so many different ways, and sometimes you get to my age or your age, and I don't suppose if you apply for a job today, uh, anybody be really asking about your academic qualifications.
no, yes, I'm just sort of starting to navigate a little bit of that with my kids. My eldest daughter's just sort of coming into GCSEs, and yeah, she's sort of just starting to get a bit angsty about it all, and I'm just trying to tell her that, it's okay, the world's different now, and you've got lots of options, and relax a little bit. But anyway, okay, so you did your degree in agriculture. Did
Yep.
you did you go straight into farming again then?
Went back home, did 5 years there, and in that time, I started writing for Farmers Weekly as a contributor in the old farm life section. Carved out a bit of a niche for myself there as someone doing sort of semi-humorous, sideways observations, that sort of thing, a little bit like what you're doing now, much better than I was, but built up the relationship, and then one thing led to another, and the opportunity came along via the British Guild of Agricultural Journalists to do some work experience down here in Sutton at the office, and at that time, they had a vacancy for an arable reporter. So I had a great week helping out, doing some work experience. It was just a week of fun. I hadn't come down with the expectation or even thinking to audition. And I suppose that took the shackles off in a way. I wasn't nervous at all because I didn't think it was going to lead to anything. And at the end of the week, they said, would you be interested in applying for the job? And that's absolutely knocked me for six. But went home, thought about it, talked about it with mum and dad. In that time, of course, they'd stocked up the farm a lot more. We had beef and sheep farm. We'd got at least another 100 ewes, probably a bit more. Bought a few more cows. They'd were putting a system in place that would accommodate that extra cost in me.
Hmm.
And so I knew walking away at that point would leave them with a lot of work, and they'd have to undo some plans that they had already started. So it was a serious decision, but they were incredibly supportive and said, look, things like this don't come along very often. You've got to try um, and just see how it goes. You can always come back. And so remain very grateful for that attitude from them, because I think in another farming family, in another situation, that could have been a very different conversation,
Yeah.
and it's totally understandable, why I understand why sometimes the older generation would be negative in that scenario. But I think where possible, it is the right approach, because you have got to try and experiment and take opportunities where you can, because there is always that lingering regret, I think, that a lot of people carry for
Mm.
having not grabbed something at some point.
100%. And that, I mean, it's a really big move, isn't it? You come from rural Wales, that's where you lived. You've been to Aberystwyth, which is, by Wales standards, quite a big town, I guess, but it's hardly a metropolis. And then gone back to the farm, and then suddenly you move into London.
Yeah.
That's a you think about it, that's a really big deal.
There's two moments in that first month that really stick in my mind. The one was on the actual journey down with all the stuff in my car. Um, and I'd barely driven on the motorway because why would you leave Wales?
Yeah.
There's nothing out there that's better, right? And so following the sat nav down, already big deal down the M40, and then suddenly you're on the M25, and there's this part where it goes, if you're going southbound, you go round Heathrow, and it's a five-laner at that point because it can take you off on a junction as well as keeping the three lanes for traffic. And so there was steady traffic. So it was paused at one point, sat in the middle of this five-lane motorway. It was dark, lights all around me, lights coming from the other direction, over the top of me, planes coming in every 90 seconds, taking off and landing. And it was a moment where I
I
thought,
bet.
this is the scale of the change I'm making.
Mm,
And then the other was the first weekend. I left my lodgings in South London and went up to North London to Primrose Hill, which is a lovely viewing spot where you can look back into the centre of London and take in that sort of cityscape, and just all of the buildings and the high rises stretched out before me. And that was the other moment where I thought, wow, this place is enormous, and I'm very out of my depth.
yeah. No, I can well imagine. So, well, perhaps I can't, but I was saying that it's uh, yeah, must have been a bit of a mind blower. So, in those early days, then, when you first started the job, what kind of thing were you sort of going around farms? You were an arable
Yeah,
reporter. Were you sort of heading out to the kind of east of England and reporting on issues and things
totally.
over there?
And that was such a learning curve. I'd done obviously some arable studying as part of my degree, but that had
Mm,
been a few years prior. And Aberystwyth, of course, they teach you in the round about agriculture, but they have more of a focus there on they have a specialty in dairy in particular.
yeah.
And so it's down the pecking order, shall we say. So I had to throw myself into learning about the arable sector, throw myself into learning about journalism, and it was just that. So that was October 2016, and that first 12 months, I did a journalism qualification on nights and weekends, and I was out in the car just a lot, meeting farmers, talking to farmers, and then in the office just with colleagues, learning constantly. And I just absolutely loved that year. It was just such a fantastic time, and seeing so much of the UK that I hadn't seen. Come from Wales, you don't see much blowing sand. You never
No.
think of that as a problem. You don't think of uh, um, the upside of clays and peats as well as the downsides.
Yeah.
You don't think about crop rotations and the challenges there, and having to make last minute decisions, and think about wet harvest and drying grain. There's all those challenges that arable farmers face. I was experiencing it for the first time, and starting in October was a really good time because I went through a cropping year from start to finish then at the point of joining. So it was brilliant.
Yeah, I remember. I think it must have been. I don't know. It was when I was still at university, or certainly maybe just after. I'd never been to the Fens in the east of England, and something took me to the Fens. I think it was to see a friend who farmed there, and it blew my mind how I didn't realize parts of Britain could be so flat. Like you can't see any hills, and I felt really sort of discombobulated there because it was coming from kind of Welsh borders. It was an odd experience. So, yeah, I can imagine you must have gone to some interesting places.
And remarkable to think about how that is almost completely a man-made landscape,
Yeah,
that area. You
yeah,
know, right back to was it the Duke of Bedford and draining the fens with those Dutch engineers. What an undertaking.
that's right.
Fantastic. And such a vital part of the UK's food security now, but also a very vulnerable area in so many ways. So it's a fascinating part of England.
Yeah, I think sometimes we forget how diverse agriculturally Britain is in this tiny island. all the different systems and all the different farms. I mean, when you were going around those farms, and was it the human side, the human interest stories that fascinated you the most, or was it the more technical stuff?
Well, you quickly taught at Farmers Weekly that case study led stories, stories about problems, but told through the lens of how a farmer overcame them and one person's experience is what people typically want to read. Of course, we have a variation, but put this is a people business and
Mm,
put in a person at the center of a story, even if that's a method to educate or inform about how you tackle blackgrass or improve your nematovirus control in sheep or nematodes in potatoes, whatever it is. It's the people that overcame it and their experience. And if you can make that leap off the page, you make that story enjoyable to read, but also
yeah.
hopefully the information drops in. So learning how to build relationships with people and unlocking those things they know in their head that perhaps they don't even realize
Mm,
was a component of that success um, was as part of the soft skills, I suppose, that I found really enjoyable. um, I'm a people person, and that was one of the push factors that drove me away from thinking about farming as a future, contemplating being alone a lot of the day and running a business by myself. That wasn't an appeal, that independence that I think a lot
hmm.
of farmers thrive on and enjoy.
Yeah.
But I loved talking to people, telling their stories, learning about them, and and most of the time as a journalist, the simplest thing is just to admit you don't know something
Yeah.
and you want to try and show your knowledge. That's the default, I think, when you normally meet someone and talk to
Mm,
someone. But most people enjoy being a teacher and enjoy being the expert and telling this young, foolish journalist how things really are here in the fens. And if you can download that and recraft it back into a readable story, that's the essence of the job.
yeah. Really cool. Um, you mentioned that you started there in October 2016, was it? And here we are in the summer of 2025, or coming into the summer of 2025. Um, and you've gone from being a trainee arable reporter to the editor, and you've been the editor for a few years. That's quite the journey that you've been on. Very, very fast rise to the top.
Yes. And that is down to, the support and mentoring of the team that allowed me to develop. I went from arable reporter to deputy business editor, and that was another great schooling in farming, and then in the broadest sense there, because that's trying to take more of a top-down approach across all the farming sectors. And that, in hindsight, was a great education then for being editor when you're trying to have that big picture view of farming, often
Mm,
writing the editorials and just thinking about where the sector's going in general. So immerse myself much more in the economics and the farm management side of things and met a whole lot of people, focused on that again. And then there was some developments at Farmers Weekly. We changed owners. So we learnt in 2019 that the business was for sale. The deal went through in January 2021. We were acquired by Mark Allen Group and sold by Relics or Reed Elsevier, as perhaps a few more people will know it, as a major publisher on the FTSE, who's shifted more into data products rather than publishing since the rise of the internet. Mark Allen Group still want to plug away at publishing and events and be a sort of more typical publisher, and they see more value in those print products that still um, have a place on people's tables even now when there's so many other routes to market. So we were acquired then, just as COVID was kicking off. It's a very chaotic year, 2020. Suddenly we were learning how to all work from home
yeah.
and produce a magazine at home. I think there was we came closer than we ever had to not putting a magazine on a shelf one of those first weeks after everybody
Yeah.
went home just because the systems nearly fell over. And then stabilized, the
Mm,
company stabilized. There was a lot of panic generally. Our events business shut overnight. I think the top management for a few months were very, very worried about the business cash flow and what was going to
mhm.
happen. And things settled down then in some ways by the end of 2020. as people may remember, we were opening and shutting, and COVID was still very much a thing. But a lot of businesses had come to cope in a new way, and my predecessor, Carl Schneider, had always had an intention to see the business through the transition to a new owner for 12 months and then retire. It was his last job. Um, and so they were looking for a new editor, and effectively, I think two types of people can edit a technical magazine or a specialist title. You can have your generalist um, journalism and publishing expert who understands intimately the business of publishing,
Mm.
or you can have your sectoral expert. And so in Carl, they had the former, and they decided next time we'll have a go at the latter. We'll try a sector specialist. And so that was what put me in the running, despite being quite junior, relatively junior. And I came to the top of the pack, and so it was very exciting and very frightening as well to learn that I'd got the job.
Yeah, I bet it was. And I guess, I mean, you and I both share a love for Teddy Roosevelt quotes, and we've bonded over this in the past. But I'm just thinking, there's that Roosevelt quote. Is it something like, if someone asks you to do something, tell them, "Sure, I can," and then you learn while you're doing it. So I've butchered that, but
Something,
it's something
yeah,
along those lines, isn't it? So I guess it must have been. There must have been an element of that, I suppose.
definitely. Um, we're very fortunate at Farmers Weekly to still have a relatively large team compared to a lot of magazines nowadays. And the people around me are the ones who, since becoming editor again, as same as at every stage in my career, have supported me to educate me, help me learn on the
Mm,
job. And even now, the expertise, the depth of expertise here in publishing and farming is tremendous. And so um, I'm very fortunate to have a supportive managing director, as well as colleagues, particularly Emma Northam, the the managing editor as her title, but she's sort of effectively runs so much of the operations here and allows me to be the farming face out on the road. And were it not for her in particular, I wouldn't be able to just be out there talking farming to people so much, because this is a big machine to produce um, a
yeah,
magazine every week and keep the website fed and all those other things we do. And it just requires a lot of work, a lot of people.
yeah. No, I can well imagine. And just for people who might not be from the agricultural world or indeed from other countries, just tell us a little bit about Farmers Weekly and the history of it, because it's got a hell of a legacy, isn't it? And there's this sort of iconic yellow and red cover and font. Everyone remembers it always being around on their farmhouse kitchen tables from when they were kids, and their
Yeah.
grandparents reading it, and it's kind of always there in farming, isn't it?
Yeah. So we were founded in 1934, and two publishing giants put the money up and founded us, Lord Rothermere, whose successors still own the Daily Mail, and Lord Beaverbrook, who was the owner of the Daily Express at that time and later went on to become Churchill's Minister of Aircraft Production.
That's right.
I prefer to talk about him a bit more than Rothermere, who became the most prominent Nazi of the 1930s.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
so yeah, two giant press magnates, and of course, they had a multitude of operations, both of them. And I'm sure the idea was pitched at a boardroom in which they were sat, and then I assume they probably didn't have a great deal to do with it thereafter, apart from looking at the numbers. But it's nice to think that we're part of that sort of um, in the orbit of two of the publishing giants of that day.
Yeah.
Um, it was um, founded to be a riposte to what even then was called the sort of staid and placid existing farming press. Farmers Weekly was founded to shake things up, and we were launched in June, and by I think the end of that year, by the end of 1934, we were selling some 90,000 copies a week, which must have been tremendous. although of course the farming and rural population of that time was enormous compared to the present day. So it's certainly not a like for like, but it must have been enormously exciting to found something and to see it really capture the public imagination. And sort of charting the history, it's amazing to look back through those old volumes and see how they grappled with the Second World War, with the shortages that persisted thereafter, to look at the coverage of the entry into the EU and all the tumult, or the EEC as it was then in the 1970s, and that production boom era of the 80s, and then tapering away a little bit then as things changed, and consolidation happened at a faster pace then through the 90s and noughties. And this iconic front cover, I think one of the, probably to me, one of the most striking of all time is during the 2001 foot and mouth crisis, just a flaming pyre of
Mm.
carcasses. And so yeah, it's been there on farmers' kitchen tables through an awful lot of ups and downs.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, a hell of a legacy for you to be part of as an editor. What kind of an editor are you? I'm sort of picturing, all the president's men, Woodward and Bernstein, entering the office, and you're there, feet on your desk, big cigar. What have you got for me?
It's yeah, it's like a documentary. That's exactly how it is. Yeah, I have the big corner
Braces.
office, secretaries scurrying around me, six or seven of them,
Yeah.
huge bottle of whiskey in the bottom drawer. Yeah, I wish. We've moved offices recently. We used to be just up the road in a very large tower block where our previous owner had at one time the whole building, and it very much was that typical publishing building, they say, of the era from the
Yeah.
70s, when basically money was no object. Yeah, and the bottom was a garage where they serviced the company cars,
Wow.
and at the top was the executive dining room and offices, the deep pile carpet, the you name it, all
Yeah.
the luxuries. And in between was, you know, training, journalism schools, and obviously the shop floor where all of the magazines were based. And the whole building just lived on stories. It must have been a fantastic era. And we were,
Mm,
it's still great to meet some of the older journalists from that era and hear the tales of how things were
I bet.
in the at the peak. They didn't even have expense accounts, I don't think, until the 80s. They didn't bother to set a budget. It was fine. That speaks to the
Yeah.
arrogance of the publishing era then, but also to the
Yeah.
probably the money that was washing through farming that is absent to some extent nowadays.
Yeah. Okay. So tell us how the magazine process works. Obviously we all sort of happily read Farmers Weekly every week, but how does it work from start to actually holding a print copy in your hands?
Yeah. So I suppose the first thing to say is to acknowledge how far ahead most of the staff on the technical sections work. So they are looking ahead and writing stories that will be published, particularly in the case of machinery, maybe up to 2 months ahead. They build up a real volume of content, and um, that's important because issue sizes can flex. If you add in more adverts to keep
Hmm.
the ratio of stories to adverts sound, you've got to sometimes add in more content. But it's also, it's an insurance against anything happening. You've always got a buffer, and that's very comforting to a section editor.
Yeah.
That's a bit trickier, particularly for the arable section, because they are so seasonal and so focused on the challenge of the next month. So
Yeah.
you can't get too far ahead. And obviously, news, it's the challenges and the what's happening in the,
Yeah.
of that week. So they are very up to the minute. So there's a lot of logistics and a lot of scheduling and a lot, we try and plan ahead as much as we can, so that the finishing touches can then be applied in the week of production for that magazine, and it can be as hassle-free as possible. So a journalist will write a story. It will get plugged into all of our online content management systems. From there, it will get grabbed by our production staff. Some of them will be laying it out on a page, picture editor bringing in the pictures that have been filed alongside the story, putting them on page, thinking about design. How can we make some boxes and pull quotes, and do we need a graph here? All of those things. Somebody else sometimes be grabbing it for web, wanting to put it online. Is there a different challenge with the layout there? When does it need to go up? Get it scheduled in. Let's let's keep the let's keep the engine fully fed. Uh, and so there's some back and forth then between the journalist and the production team looking at various drafts, trying to get everything finalized, making sure everything from accuracy down to grammar is all sorted.
Mm.
Things always slip through, but we try and minimize that as much as possible. Um, I like to say, farmers always think about the field by the road, don't they?
Yes.
What is what the neighbours are looking at? Well, all of
Yeah.
our fields are by the road. Everybody's scrutinising our copy once it's out in the world. There's nowhere to hide,
Yeah.
and that's a challenge that you can never quite crack. You're never going to be perfect, but you always try and be as close to it as possible.
Yeah.
So that's the in a nutshell. That's the job. So the middle half of the magazine goes to the printer on a Tuesday. They print it Tuesday night. The outside half of the magazine, including the news section, your page, the market data, that's printed on a Wednesday afternoon. Distribution happens on a Thursday to get it out to the news agents and into
Mm.
the mail system. And then if the postman's doing or the post lady are doing their job, it should be landing on your mat then on a Friday or in the shop where you buy it.
Wow. There's a lot of moving parts, isn't there?
Yeah.
You don't I don't think any of us appreciate how much sort of work and how many different people are involved and
So we're
yeah.
talking on a Thursday, and most of the features will have been written, filed, and the first draft will be on a page now for the editors to look at for next
Mm.
week. And they'll try and get as much of that done before the press day, just to take the stress off them and the production team, just so you can keep ahead, keep that buffer, so that when a problem happens, it's not fatal.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I find it fascinating, and I suppose you've got obviously all the trained journalists writing for the magazine, but you've also got farmers like me who've got you trying to juggle family farms, but get pieces in for the magazine as well. So that's I guess that's a bit of a challenge sometimes for the team there as well, isn't it? To kind of get frantically emailing farmers to say,
Yes.
where's your bloody copy this week?
And sometimes, you do meet occasionally someone very frustrating that is a brilliant writer, but just terrible at deadlines. And you
Yeah,
have to make a decision about whether the ends justify the means. Is the hassle worth it?
yeah, I can imagine. I can
It's it's
imagine.
it's a difficult balance. If somebody will always turn in their copy half an hour before they're meant to, fantastic.
Mm,
That's a big help on.
yeah, yeah. Well, yeah. I usually hit my deadlines.
You
I
do.
think
You're very good.
yeah. If Emma's listening, I've occasionally have to ask for an extension of a day or two if I'm very busy, but usually I'm all right at that. But yeah, okay. Um, how has this is I guess a really big question. We could probably talk about it all day. But how has print journalism changed, even in just the time that you've been involved, both in terms of mainstream and within agricultural publications?
I think I think it would be fair to say for magazines, no, not newspapers. I think for magazines, most of the ones that are going to die have died. I think the
Yeah,
sector is a bit stronger, perhaps, than people who take a passing interest think.
yeah,
Uh, Print is a medium. There are many ways now to get a story into someone, and you've got to meet them at the point of their need and bring it to them how and when they want it. You can't dictate that anymore. It used to be it was print or nothing, right? But when you think of the experience of a magazine versus the experience of a smartphone, of course, print, it doesn't have the immediacy, it doesn't have the efficiency, but actually, it's a very good medium in that you can sit there and there's no notifications dropping down over it. There's no ads in it flashing. It's never going to break. It's never going to run out of battery. You don't have to plug it in. It's it's pleasant. And
Mm.
if you get to the point where you have formed a print habit and you enjoy that as part of your daily or weekly routine, I think there's a lot of people out there who still want that experience. And certainly we're very grateful that the Farmers Weekly audience is one of those resilient audiences that do want that. Partly because um, they are typically a little bit older demographically, but I think even that can be overrated because we know now the older generation do have their iPad, they have got their smartphone, they have made the transition, but they still want the print product.
Mm.
And so um, the sector as a whole, yes, it's still tapering off, but I think that there's a lot of resilient products out there now, and the one that's always held up as the best of that is Private Eye. They've got the biggest print circulation. What are they,
Yeah.
fortnightly? But if you take that across a month and compare it to practically anything, they blow it out the water. They've barely got a website. They don't do events. They don't do all of the fashionable things that other publishers do, but they've just got a really good print product because there's great content in it. It looks terrible, but because the content is what the readers
Yeah.
want to read, doesn't matter. And so
Yeah.
it comes back to the quality of the story and the quality of the experience, and it's still a good future for it.
Yeah. I love Private Eye. It feels to me, and I've got no, I haven't kind of come across any articles on this or any evidence of this, but it just feels to me that people are maybe going back to reading longer form articles again. You know, you're seeing a lot of stuff with kind of Substack, and you mentioned kind of Private Eye, things like the Atlantic have obviously had a lot of big stories lately, and
Yeah.
even and then even if you go to the other side of it, a few years ago, I remember people were sort of writing about the end of the book, the printed book. You know, everybody's going to be reading on Kindles or iPads. Well, that hasn't happened, has it? You know, people are still reading, and it feels like that's kind of coming back. Would you agree?
To an extent, I think the book market is a very different beast, and I think it benefits enormously by books having an aesthetic as well as the value of their content.
Yeah,
People
the
like to
feel.
have them on display. They
Yeah.
look great. They bring joy to the buyers, but also I think, you see all of these interior design things now where the books are color coded and what have you, and the books are just there. They have a performative element. I think
Yeah.
magazines are a little bit more transient. They often go in the bin, don't they, after that week? But even that, there's probably an element of that. People, it's a bit of a flex, isn't it, to maybe have a few current affairs magazines out on show when you bring a date home. It's like, look how sophisticated I am. I read the Atlantic. I'm kind of a big deal. So
Yeah.
is a bit of that. But
Yeah.
look, I think when you think about the different demographics and how they want to you know, consume content, we've talked about what the value of the print product is, but there's no getting away from the fact that obviously digital is dominating and will continue to dominate. And if you don't form that habit that I referred to earlier, where do you get your news from and how can
Mm.
you meet the needs of that consumer is the questions that really absorb us at the moment for the long-term health of the brand.
Yeah.
There's a sort of uh, we think in terms of this young, sophisticated farmer. Let's say they're 24. They may have their own business already, or they may be an aspiring farm manager, and they've never subscribed to us. They might have seen us, but they think of us as a magazine, but they don't read magazines, and we've not been able to reach them with the content online. They're not interested in subscription products at all yet. Money's a bit tight.
Hmm.
Where do they get their information from? WhatsApp groups. They're a competitor to us. It's never been easier to talk to your friends about the problem you're facing.
Hmm.
Uh, YouTube, some great communicators online there, social media, and or lots of other routes. We are writing content that is interesting and important to them. But if we can't market that content to make them realize that and get through to them, It doesn't matter if we've wrote the best article in the exact right week that helps them tackle their problem. If it doesn't get under their nose, we've got a problem because they can't find our value. So that's probably the thing that worries me the most, because even though we've innovated and we're doing podcasts, we're doing the web, if the culture of if we're still, if we're still seen as predominantly a print product, I think that is holding back some people from giving us a try. So we've got this brilliant print identity that works for the majority of audience now, but if we're seen too much as a print product in the long term, I think people will not even think to consider us as an option to help them with their farming life.
Yeah. It's interesting with social media, isn't it? And I guess this is one of the big um, issues that a lot of traditional media are facing. That there are some really big social media platforms and people who've got often hundreds of thousands of followers or even millions, and they can express an opinion on something, and we see this in farming circles, and it doesn't matter whether that's the right opinion, it doesn't matter whether it's the wrong opinion. They've got so many followers that it goes around the world and it very quickly becomes gospel. And that must be very hard to navigate for you guys as journalists, where, and I know you get the sort of people often accuse the media of bias, but usually there is obviously a far more of an element of checks and balances and having to research before you put something out there, rather than someone with just a large voice on social media. And
Yeah,
that must be quite hard to deal with, I would imagine.
I mean, yes and no. I think if the most optimistic viewpoint is, look, the world is as it is. We must take it as it is, not how we want it to be.
Mm,
And the more crazy social media gets, the more commercial value, in a sense, there is in a quality brand where people know that the way I pitch it often is, um, you can, it's you can come to us for the facts and make up your own mind. Whereas, and is there
yeah,
the more people are trying to shove an opinion down your throat on social media, there's a value in Farmers Weekly for being the opposite of that. And
yeah,
of course, we have biases, and I'm always keen to stress that. I think even the BBC does. At the very base level, the bias is what you choose to cover and not cover,
yeah.
as much as the way it is covered, because the absence of a story is a choice and a bias in and of itself. So sometimes
Mm,
we get criticized for covering perhaps too much about regenerative agriculture and not as much about uh, conventional agriculture, whatever that is.
yeah,
But we made a decision that this was a sector that people are talking about a lot. It's different to how most people know about how farming operates. Therefore, there's an opportunity to educate. We're not telling people to be regenerative farmers, but if they want to look over the hedge through Farmers Weekly, we're giving them that opportunity to do that. But some people will always interpret that as, oh, we're regen. We just want to shove that down people's throats.
hmm
But sometimes you're just simply responding to what you perceive as a demand. And of course, there's always an element sometimes of you look at the traffic and you see those regen articles have got good readership, and probably a component of those are people hate reading it because they disagree with it. But there's the ones who are minded to read it because they think I might learn something here.
Yeah. No, that's really, really interesting. It's not actually something I've particularly thought about before, how you choose so which stories to cover. But yeah, I'm sure people will be interested to hear that. Um, Talking about sort of difficult issues, how do you, there are some things that FW have covered in recent times, and I'm thinking specifically when you covered um, cases of sexual harassment and abuse towards women in the farming industry. Obviously, an incredibly difficult thing to talk about and even admit as an industry. and it might be easy for you guys to go, actually, we're not going to touch that because, we're going to get pushback from certain sectors. But I was actually very proud that Farmers Weekly did that, as someone who is, I guess, associated with you guys. Um, and I thought that was a brilliant thing you did. It was very brave. That must have been a big decision to decide to cover something like that.
Yes, it was. Um, and the fallout from it, it was difficult and it was disappointing
Yeah.
because Abby Kay, deputy editor here at Farmers Weekly, she recognized the uh, risk
Mm,
of how that story could land if we did it the wrong way.
mm,
She worked really hard to write a very balanced piece
yeah.
that said, on one hand, this, and spoke to a lot of people, and they said this is definitely happening. But on the other hand, that, and obviously acknowledged that young farmers, lowercase, no, not necessarily the organisation, but young farmers in general, uh, this isn't a saturation point. This isn't happening every night in every
Hmm.
village. Um, but we wanted to acknowledge that the problem was there to an extent. We wanted to portray the world as it was, not how we wanted it to be.
Mm,
And so, there was extra care taken with that coverage, a lot of extra care.
yeah.
And then because it really got going on social media and it got picked up by the national press, who rewrote it up in a much more simplistic fashion.
Yeah.
As that was one problem, it took some of the nuance out of it. And then the other problem was some of the nuance was taken out of it by people who were reading reaction to it on social media rather than reading the piece itself. And and that is how a perception takes hold that maybe runs ahead of the reality of the
Hmm.
content. But I know there are people out there who still believe, who did read the story carefully, that we shouldn't have done that. And because of what happened and because of the risk of, trashing farming's reputation. But I have been a young farmer in both senses. I have been witness to these things that happened. I want young farmers to have a great reputation in all senses. And sometimes that means calling out the bad and trying to do your bit to make the world better rather than
Yeah.
hoping it does that on its own. And I think, when I reflect on that period now, I don't regret our coverage at all. We wore the criticism of those pieces in public, and we had the thanks and the gratitude often in private from
Yeah.
the people for whom they had had those experiences. But of course, they didn't want to share that publicly for a multitude of reasons, not
Mm,
least because they would then be they would then be at risk of a pile on in the way that we were being piled on.
yeah. Yeah, for sure. Um, do you? I guess it comes with the territory that you have to have a thick skin to be a journalist and an editor. Does I mean, as a sort of contributor to the magazine, I have the luxury of not. I never look at the comments below when they're posted on Farmers Weekly social media feed. I never look at I never look and see what people say because I just don't feel like being called a dickhead on a daily basis. But you can't do that. You've got to look at the comments because you've got to see the feedback. Does that ever get to you, or do you just
Of
kind
course, it
of
does. You
yeah?
you want the magazine to be respected as editor. The the responsibility for how it is perceived
Mm,
rests with me. I want to be the lightning rod for criticism of anyone in the team rather than it go onto their shoulders
mm,
because ultimately the buck stops with the editor. And so obviously it's much nicer in those weeks where you do a good job and you get the credit than in those weeks where the opposite happens.
hmm.
Um, and you do, yes, a thick skin is important, but obviously you have to be big enough to acknowledge sometimes when people are correct and try and take feedback in a good spirit too. Um, you know, comments below the line are one thing. I also get correspondence in my inbox, and I think if somebody's taken the time to write to me,
Yeah,
I try and reply to all of those, um, because it's important. And I also have a feeling for every one person that goes to the trouble of contacting me to express a view, they are probably representative of another however many people who have read that, been grumpy, and just moved on with their life. Because
yeah,
not everyone's got time to write to the editor, have they?
no, no. We're obviously dealing with a time in UK agriculture at the moment where there's been a lot of controversial government policy, and some people might think that's an understatement. There's been changes to inheritance tax. The SFI applications have been stopped. That's the Sustainable Farming Incentive in England, and a lot of farmers are very angry. There's been protests. That must be something that is also quite hard to cover from you guys' perspective because there are two sides to that story, and people even within farming have different opinions on it, but you kind of have to take a side, I guess, with something like this. You can't just kind of sit back and say, well, I can see both sides of the argument. You've got to, yeah. How do you navigate that?
Taking a side is a choice. On big issues.
Yeah.
Before I joined, obviously, the Brexit referendum happened. It was in the year,
Hmm.
the same year that I joined, but prior to my joining. And there was a very deliberate decision taken at that time to say, here are the facts. You make your own mind up. We
Mm.
recognize that our audience is split down the middle. What's the point in pissing off half of them by taking a stand?
Yeah.
Whichever way you go, right? Uh, and really, honestly, this is just up to the conscience of each and every voter. And so, therefore, here's what the experts are saying will happen if we vote this way, and here's what the experts are saying will happen if we vote that way. Job done. Inheritance tax, it you know the it's been definitely the biggest story of the last 12 months by
Hmm.
some margin. What I found interesting was probably it was the the biggest story in terms of impact probably since Brexit because of devolution. There are very few decisions now taken in Westminster that affect all farmers.
Yeah.
So a massive story in England over sustainable farming incentive. Well, I mean, you and your fellow Welsh farmers, you're interested in a sort of, oh, that's happening over there, and isn't that a shame or whatever? And you like to follow the soap opera and what your fellow farmers are getting or not getting, but it's not putting a pound in your pocket.
Mm.
Doesn't it doesn't matter as much. The inheritance tax mattered to everyone, and yes, there were pros and cons, and views on both sides, but I really felt that we couldn't reflect the anger of the majority without taking a stand in this instance. And so we have, as an editorial line, we have definitely come out in favor of those changes being walked back in some form, in support of all of those farmers that turned out to protest and were against it in whatever form.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Um, what have you learned about leadership in your time? Because as I sort of alluded to earlier, you suddenly in that position as editor, and I guess you kind of have to learn. You've already said you're a people person, and you must have learned an awful lot even before you became editor. But suddenly you're in charge of lots of different personalities, lots of different people who want to do different things in different ways, and even then with your readership, you must have been on quite the to use the sort of the crap term, the leadership journey.
Yeah.
I'd really sort of interested to hear your reflections on what you've learned over the last few years.
Well, there's three legs to it. so there's a form of leadership is managing upwards, representing the business to the owners,
Hmm.
Mark Allen Group. And I've got my twice annual board meeting next week, where we have to go and present on how the business is going, my perspective, and be part of the management team at Farmers Weekly to account for our financials and also every other aspect of the business, innovation, all
Hmm.
that. So that's been a learning curve. Been through my editorial writing, through public speaking, and generally trying to be the face of the brand back out to our audience. That's definitely a form of leadership.
Yeah.
It's very gratifying that people sometimes want to hear what I have to say, uh, but it requires a level of professionalism. When you're representing this business, I'm only the 10th editor, and you really feel that you know the buck stops with you at this point, and you want to maintain the quality of the business in the eyes of the readers, and you feel the pressure and responsibility of that. And then, of course, being the team leader and managing the team, which is where people most traditionally or perhaps most commonly think of how I am a leader. And that's been the most rewarding and the most challenging part of the job, I would say. Anyone who knows about people management knows that things always take you by surprise. There's always someone um, hands in their notice unexpectedly. You have a recruitment challenge or is facing a difficult time in their personal life. And of course, that bleeds into their work, and you have to weigh up how to support them versus how to keep the business running smoothly. And just generally trying to lead and take decisions that take things off their plate so that they can focus on doing their job and be that be their representative upwards. And that's a responsibility too. Things like disgruntlement over pay and conditions like happen in every business, and,
Hmm.
and, and everything else too. So there's so many facets to it. And I think this is where most people descend into platitudes, isn't it? And try and deal fairly and be honest and be the leader you would want to be led by, and all of that sort of thing. And
Yeah.
but it is hard to talk about it at a granular level, because um, I, because of that. I think you can make plans and you can set strategies, but so often, you are having to respond to events, and I
Mm.
think that is probably the thing that is hardest.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I can well imagine. I mean, you make it look, and I sort of don't. I'm not just saying this because you're a mate, but you make it look very like your editorials are always funny, and I've heard lots of other people say that to me as well, that they really like your editorials and you're funny. And when people see you speak, the Farmers Weekly Awards, if you take that as an example, I don't know how many people you have in the room, but it's huge, grand awards, and there's hundreds and hundreds of people there, and you get up on stage and you speak to them, and you always look like you're very comfortable, like it kind of comes easy to you, but I'm sure it doesn't. Do you enjoy that? Do you get very nervous? How do you deal with all that?
From the time I was doing Young Farmers Club public speaking events, I've, always enjoyed the adrenaline rush of public speaking.
Yeah, okay.
If the, it's an ego thing, to win at those competitions and to speak in public.
Mm,
You have to acknowledge that there is an element of ego in it. And I wouldn't have applied for this job if I didn't derive some pleasure from that, because otherwise there's going to be too many painful days. And so I do like doing it. I do, but I still get nervous. So the awards is an interesting example, because often I craft words to be written, and crafting words to be spoken I think of as quite a different art. So
mm,
the sentence structure and what you do and how you go about writing that is a muscle that I don't flex as much. So once I have the speech written and I'm comfortable with it, I think that dispels a lot of the nerves. And then on the day, when I get to the venue, which is obviously a lot earlier than most people, I think that's when I'm nervous, when I see the room for the first time and see the scale of it, and they're still putting the tables out and polishing the cutlery at that point and doing the sound checks. And there's all these people around you servicing this huge event, and you're aware that for a small part of that time, you're going to be the focus of everyone. And that's very sobering. And then for whatever reason, I find that the closer I get to the time I go on stage, normally that dispels a little bit.
Mm,
And I can get the nerves out of the way and feel excited,
yeah.
which is, thank you to my nervous system for whatever,
Yeah.
for why ever that is. I guess it's about preparation, isn't it?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah. Yeah, because if that was me, I'd be throwing up 5 minutes before. I'd be so nervous.
The editorials are the same. I used to
Yeah.
start them on a Monday and
Mm,
then finish them on a Wednesday. And then the more confident you get that you can respond to events closer and closer to the time, and you know, I've had writer's block, but I've never not managed to write one. And you think, okay, you know, this is something I'm more accomplished at now. Now I start them on a Wednesday morning, and
yeah.
I'm writing and redrafting right up until um, Michelle, our production editor, is getting very cross with me. Uh, but you know, I haven't left a blank space in the magazine yet.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, same with me actually. The more I've done it, the more the easier it's become in a way.
Yeah,
But yeah, okay. Um, what are you most proud of over your time at FW so far? What sort of, when none of us give ourselves credit enough sometimes, do we? Because we're all so busy in our lives, but if you stop and think about it, what are you most proud of?
I think the editorial team, I'm really proud. There's some very long-standing members of staff here who have stayed on under my tenure, and they're
Hmm.
clearly still enjoying their work. So I'm proud of that, and I'm proud of the new people that I've brought into the business as well. So a team, you know, a team has to have that balance. I wouldn't want everyone to stay forever because new blood is always exciting, but you always want that institutional memory as well.
Yeah,
So I feel like the team's got a great balance at the moment, um, and so that's fantastic. And but as a journalist, you know, it is about the biggest stories and the most impactful front covers. Those are the things I think about too. So
yeah,
the way we covered the meat scandal story, you know, Abby Kay deserves the lion's share of the
yeah,
credit there for bringing that in, but working in partnership with her behind the scenes at every step of the way, discussing that, honing that, working with the lawyers to make sure it was printable and we weren't going to get sued. You know, those weeks when we knew that that was coming and we were hoping that we would be able to get it to a state where we were felt safe to publish, they were some of the most sort of raw, exciting
I bet.
times. And then I am proud of the invitations I get both to speak and the events I get to attend. As a
Mm,
rep, you always remember that it's because you're sat in the editor's chair and it's the editor, not you personally, that's getting the invitation. But it's fantastic to get entree into some of the farming's best annual events and to meet the people right at the top of our profession across agribusiness, meeting chief executives and at one end of the spectrum who are running these multi-billion-pound businesses, and then brilliant farmers of all scales and been welcomed onto their farms and seeing how they do it. And you just been able to have a job with variety and a job that you learn something new every week. That's such a reward when you think of um, some people who have to earn a wage from more repetition. I think farming is blessed with that anyway. A lot of farming is seasonal, and there's a joy in that, isn't there,
yeah,
compared to working in a factory where you're screwing a nut onto a bolt in the same way, Monday to Friday.
yeah. Yeah. Okay. Before we sort of start to wrap things up, because I'm getting conscious of time, but I've got quite a sort of big question I just want to ask you because I think you're probably quite uniquely placed to to answer this, but what does UK agriculture, and this is a really big question, but what does UK Agriculture PLC, if you like, need at the moment for it to be able to thrive in a nutshell?
At this point, a lot of people say confidence and stability,
Mm,
and I slightly reject that. Not because I don't think those things would be useful,
mm,
but because I think the we have to deal with the world as it is, not how we want it to be. And since farm policy was repatriated, it, and it's part of the 5-year governmental cycles, whether it's Westminster or wherever you live, I think upheaval is going to be normal now.
mm,
And so where I think we'll end up is with a sector that is less reliant on support payments than they have been historically. The trouble is what that actually means in real terms for farmers is that there is still some more consolidation, some more business failure that will happen on the
yeah,
road to that. So what does that mean for food production? What does that mean for rural communities? These are difficult questions. There is downsides to having, a patchwork of small businesses that are reliant on the government. The status quo, people aren't very happy with that either.
yeah,
But there's also downsides to moving to a place where farming becomes more corporate and more large scale. So I prefer to, I don't think I've really answered your question there, Will, but I suppose what I would hold to is we have to be honest with ourselves and deal with the world as it is and position businesses, Farmers Weekly included, for how we think it is going to end up. And it is honest to do that even while campaigning for something else.
mm,
So people should be putting their affairs in order now so that they minimize the impact of the new inheritance tax regime while still writing letters to their MPs and doing their campaign to ask for it to be revoked. That is the sensible thing to do, isn't it?
yeah. Yeah, no, no, you haven't. I mean, I don't think there obviously isn't a definitive answer, but yeah, it's good to hear that. And I, in these times when I don't know, it can feel like a lot of people are very certain in their opinions, and I sort of increasingly feel uncertain. So, it's good to hear that. And one of the things I've really liked about FW in recent times is the fact that I don't feel like you're just telling farmers what they want to hear. I think,
Yeah,
because we get enough of that, and I think that's really, really important. And I think Farmers Weekly are doing that really well at the moment.
thank you. That's definitely the objective. We talk a lot about being a critical friend,
Yeah,
and that is important to be honest with people. But
yeah.
you can't be too critical, otherwise you're not much of a friend, and people don't want to hand over a subscription just to be bollocked every week, do they? So it's a
No.
balancing act, and we really, really, really recognise
Mm,
that it's one thing to say you should think about changing your business, and you can put that on a page every week in a magazine, and that's quite easy. But doing it at farm level is bloody hard,
yeah,
and there's so much going on with the barriers to that.
yeah,
It,
yeah,
this is a difficult time, and it is going. The honest thing to say to people is the likelihood is it's going to stay being difficult for quite some time, but we'll do what we can to keep you informed of what's coming, but the rest is over to the readers in how they interpret that and the decisions they choose to make.
for sure. Okay. All right then, Andrew, let's wrap things up with the traditional five hard-hitting questions. What's the best gig you've ever been to? Music, comedy, anything live?
Um, I would like to big up actually the last gig I went to, which was the Mary Wallopers. We saw them in Brixton
Oh, really
a
cool.
couple of weeks ago. For people who've not heard of them, they're a sort of slightly punk anarchy
Mm,
Irish folk group, very much like the Pogues in their heyday, a modern version of the Pogues. Just my wife's from Northern Ireland, uh, but I was actually introduced to Irish folk at university. A friend had really loved it, and I love stories in general. I love songs that tell a story. They do that. And there's a great tradition of that in Wales as well.
yeah.
But the Irish, they're much more known for it, and there's some brilliant songs there. And obviously, some of your faves too. Springsteen, he tells stories in his songs, so all of that is right in my sweet spot.
Yeah, I love Irish folk music. Absolutely love it. So yeah, you've made me happy with that one. Okay. What's the best piece of advice you've ever been given?
Um, so Mark Allen Group is still chaired by Mark Allen himself, um, and he had a big hand in, along with a panel, in my recruitment. And he told me one of his bits of advice after I appointed was most decisions don't matter a great deal. The important thing is to just make them when you're a leader, because if you otherwise, if things are sat on your desk and people are waiting for you, that's when businesses slow down and stop. So make decisions quickly to free up people to carry on carrying on.
Really like that. Really like that one. Okay, what's the best book you've ever read? Or
Um,
the one that's had the biggest impact on you, maybe.
we are both fans of that mid 20th century Americana, as we've discussed.
Yeah,
And we are both political nerds, and so the book more or series of books more than any other that is the exemplar of for political nerds in that era is Robert Caro's series on the life of Lyndon Johnson, who was the president obviously after JFK. And the way he uses that biography to tell stories about the acquisition and use of power I just find so enjoyable, and has been such a teacher when I think about how I, in my own very small way, can try and communicate to people why politicians are like the way they are here and in this moment and the
yeah.
factors affecting them. So, yeah,
Great,
fantastic series.
great answer. Have you read the Splendid and the Vile by Eric Larson? It's
No,
it's really good. It's about Churchill's first kind of 6 months in power in 1940. It's how he kind of managed that team of people who kind of loathed each other. It was it was really really cool. So you might want to check that
and
one
it's great.
out. If you could meet any historical figure, who would it be and why?
I would so Teddy Roosevelt was the first president to have press conferences, wasn't he? He used to
Yeah,
sit there having a shave and shoot in the breeze. And I'd like to join the press pack in that era, get a big curly moustache and my notepad out, and go and join the press pack then, and go and meet the big man.
yeah, brilliant. Head off for brandy and cigars afterwards.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
awesome. Okay, and lastly, then, what's your all-time favorite song?
Ah, let's bring it right back to Wales and go with anything actually from Max Boyce's Live at Treorchy. So
That was such a good answer.
whether it's the Pontypool front row, if you want to belt something out in the car,
Yeah,
sentimental, Jew, it's hard,
yeah,
or any of those Matchday Six Nations favorites, that album is on heavy rotation for me every February, March.
yeah, yeah. Me too. And you mentioned Jew, it's hard there. People kind of just think of Max Boyce as a comedian and they're funny songs, but
No,
Jew, it's hard will break your heart when you listen
yeah,
to it, won't it? It's especially if you come from I come from a sort of post-industrial part of Wales, and it's yeah, it breaks your heart listening to that song.
that's the thing that Mid Walians and perhaps North Walians are a little bit lacking in is that wonderful sentimentality of
Yeah,
those from the south,
yeah,
forged in those very, very tight-knit industrial communities.
that's right.
Just, yeah, lived on top of each other. and really looked after each other when it was going well. I know I'm very much, that is a very broad brush and a very rose-tinted way of looking at it, but
Great
yeah,
answer.
he's an exemplar of that.
Great answer. All right, Andrew. There's a million other things I could have asked you, as listeners can probably tell, and I'm sure we could have been here all day, but we've both got things to do. So, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk to us. And yeah, it's been brilliant and lovely. Just lovely to hear about sort of some of the practicalities of pulling a magazine together. It's been absolutely fascinating.
Thank you for having me on.
And to everyone at home, thanks for listening and hope to see you next time. I've had lots of lovely messages lately since the podcast back. So thank you to everybody who sent me messages. I will get time to reply soon, hopefully. But thank you. Thank you all for that. And I'm glad you're all enjoying listening again. I've been Will Evans. This has been Rock and Roll Farming. Thank you and good night.